Hello, welcome to the broadcast. I'm Billy Stewart, Assistant Pastor here at Solid Rock Tabernacle, 1325 Rudy Road in Alma, Arkansas. I just want to take a minute to extend this personal invitation to you to come and join us in one of our exciting spirit filled services. Our Sunday school begins at 9 a.m., our Sunday morning worship begins at 10 a.m., and our Sunday evening worship begins at 6 p.m. We also have an exciting Wednesday evening Bible study where we are going through the Bible book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. I think that you'll really enjoy it. Come and join us, won't you? 1325 Rudy Road here in Alma, Arkansas. Hey, we'll save a seat for you. And now, let's join our service already in progress.
About what sacrifices are done when and how often and all that stuff. So we're gonna get off of, not actually get off of Leviticus right now. We're going to suspend for just getting verse by verse part of it, and we're actually going to look at the sacrifices and get more in depth on what the sacrifices are, when they're to be done, those type of things. Okay, so let's talk about the sacrifices. Put my little thing in here so my clicker will work. There we go. All right. Remember, there are 5 types of sacrifices. Anybody remember what the 5 types of sacrifices are? Somebody give me one. Okay, well, trespass, yeah. Okay, trespass is one. Okay, it's they're all ceremonial. Yeah. So, what's another? We got trespass offering, sin offering. Okay, there's 2. Huh? That's basically the sin offering, but there's another one that goes along with the sin offering. Anybody remember? Here, I'll give you a hint. Burnt offering. Yeah, there's the burnt offering. Okay. That's one we spend a lot of time on anyway. Okay. There's 2 more. Peace offering. There's one. Yeah, there's one more. Y'all remember? Agricultural. Okay. It's grain offering. Yeah, the grain offering. Okay, very good. All right. So we have 5 types of sacrifices, and the sacrifices in the Torah, or in the first 5 books of the Bible, is actually called, in Hebrew, they're called karbanot, and that literally means to draw near, is what that word means. So the emphasis is that the purpose of the offering was to bring, and the sacrifice was to bring a person closer to God. Okay? Now, of course, remember the sacrifice was brought by the people to the entrance of the tabernacle court. Remember the tabernacle court that they have around that? We looked at that. You've got the inside of the fenced off area, you've got the altar that's there. Remember that? And then the sacrifices were made at the entrance of that court, going into it. Okay? All right? Y'all remember that? Okay? And after it was killed, after the sacrifice was killed and all the blood was drained, then it was given to one of the Kohanim, or the priests. Then they would prepare the sacrifice and they would put it on the altar. All right? Now, there were many different offerings or sacrifices made, and we were talking about. But there were 5 main sacrifices that were made, and we just listed those off. All right? So let's go over them again. The first one was the olah, or the burnt offering. Now, this was a voluntary offering, and it was the whole animal, and it was to be entirely consumed by fire. Right? None of it was saved, none of it was eaten. It was totally consumed by fire. This was an act of devotion. Yeah, it had to be their best, right? It had to be their best, and it had you couldn't, and it could be, remember, it could be the bulls or the sheep, or depending on how much a person was worth, it could even be birds. But as long as it was the best that they had, okay? Now, this was not only an act of devotion, but it was also, the burnt offering was also to do what? Does anybody remember what else the burnt offering did? It atoned for something. What did it atone for? For sin, but it atoned for unintentional sin. Okay? We talked about the unintentional sin. You can sin and not intend to sin. All right? Remember, we were talking about that. You can sin, you don't mean to sin, but you did sin. Right. All the time. You can sin, but you cannot know that you've sinned. But just because you didn't know that you sinned doesn't mean that it's not a sin. It's still a sin. Okay? Whether you knew about it or not. When it was brought to your attention that you have sinned in some way, that's when you offered a burnt sacrifice in order to atone for that unintentional sin. It was not something that you meant to do. Okay? The second offering is the grain offering, also called the mincha. This was also a voluntary offering, and it was flour, oil, frankincense, salt, remember? Part of it was burned. Right? They put part of it on there, it was burned, and part of it was given to the kohanim, or the priests. That was their kind of their payment. Right? Remember, they didn't have money back in those days. Okay? Back in those times, you were paid through barter, livestock, something like that, or grain. Something was you bartered on that. If you needed some wheat, and somebody else needed a goat, well, you would get some wheat and you would trade them the goat, okay? And then you work that out. Right? There wasn't this money. The concept of money was there, but they didn't really have the money until later on when they started doing it more. Most of the time, it was a barter type of system like that. All right? The third offering was the peace offering, or the shelamim. This was also a voluntary animal offering. And it was used for Thanksgiving, which is why you got it with the Thanksgiving offering. Not only was it meant for Thanksgiving, that you gave it to give thanks, that you just wanted to, God's blessed you in some way, and you just want to give thanks to God, so you bring it up there and you make an offering for that. But it was also used for fulfilling a vow. If you made a vow, you were supposed to make a sacrifice to basically seal that vow that you made. It's kind of like signing a contract, right? We sign a contract, that contract is binding, it takes us to court. They would make a vow, a contract with each other, make the sacrifice. Now that bound them not in court, but before God. Now if they were in breach of that contract, it was no longer just a breach of contract in a civil matter like we would have today. It would be a sin because you have breached a vow that you made to that person and that you also made to God. So then it would be a sin. Imagine if all of our contracts and the things that we had to do, the vows that we had to make, work contracts or anything like that, any kind of vow, how more apt are we going to be to actually fulfill that obligation. If we know because we don't fulfill it, it's going to be a sin. Okay? You know, if you say, somebody hires you and they said, I want you to work, 5 days a week, and then you only show up for 4, well, you've broke that. What if you start realizing that, hey, that's a sin, So that kind of puts things more in perspective of what you should do, And there's a lot of times that there's a lot of things that we say that we make vows all the time. Some of them are serious. Some of them are less serious about things. You tell a friend of yours that you're going to help them. They call you and say, hey, man, I'm moving. Hey, can you help me move? Sure, I'll be there tomorrow at noon to help you move. And then you don't show up. Well, you've broken a vow because you vowed to be there at noon. Oh, man, something came up. I'm so sorry. Couldn't make it. All right? But you've still broken that vow. All right? Here, they made the sacrifices to seal that vow that they made. And that vow was, now it was not just a vow to the person, it was a vow to God as well. All right? It was also as a show of fellowship. Not only fellowship, your fellowship with another person, but your fellowship with God as well. All right? Then there is the chatat, or the sin offering. Okay? Now, the sin offering is an obligatory sacrifice. It's one that you have to make. It's made for the atonement of unintentional sins, and there were specific procedures for the blood. Remember, they would take the blood. Some of it would be sprinkled in different places and then poured out, okay? Finally, there is the asham, which is the trespass or the guilt offering. This is another obligatory sacrifice. It was often a ram that they used, and it was required for offenses like misappropriating property. Okay? Somebody told you to put it in today's terms. You borrowed your neighbor's lawnmower and you never brought it back, okay? Or you borrowed your neighbor's garden hose and you never brought it back. Right? That's a sin, okay? That's misappropriating property. All right? Now, not every one of these sacrifices were given or made by every person every day. That's been one of the questions that's been asked. How often are these sacrifices made? Because by this time out in the wilderness, there's probably close to 1.5 million to 2 million people that are wandering around. We normally think of a fairly small crowd of people, but there's a couple million people out wandering around in the wilderness during this time. And if you got 1 million people trying to make a sacrifice every day, that makes it a little tough. But it's not every day that these people had to do it. Yes. They were out of, huh? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you to second. From the time that when they left Egypt, the time in between they left Egypt until they went into the promised land. All that time that they were wandering around in the deserts. Huh? It was the people of Israel that were there. Yeah. Yeah. It's the Israelites. They're wandering around. That was just for the Israelites. Yeah, all these sacrifices are just for the Israelites. Not for everybody, just for the Israelites. Yes. Murdering somebody? No. They're going to burn eventually, yeah. I mean, no. That's not a burn. Killing it. Well, yeah, but they would have to make a sin offering for that if they killed somebody, But it. Yeah. Well, yeah. It would cut. Of course, they would probably that they would if you murdered somebody and they caught you, you'd probably be dead before they could have a chance to do that, to make an offering or a sacrifice. But look at it. You would think, well, that won't do it. Somebody kills somebody. Why can they bring a couple of goats or something like that and sacrifice them, and their sin be forgiven? Okay, or their sin be covered. Why could they do that? Yeah, under the old thing, yeah. But still, to make atonement for that, you would still have to make the sacrifice. Now, did that cover the sin? Yes. Just like the sacrifice of Jesus cleansed our sins. That sacrifice, that's what it was. Remember, every sacrifice that we see in the Bible leads up to Jesus. And we're going to see how at the end of this. We're going to see how Jesus fulfilled each of the sacrifices. So it is, each one of these are leading up to him. So what that sacrifice did was, yes, it atoned for the sin. Didn't matter what the sin was, it atoned for the sin. You didn't have to make a bigger sacrifice the bigger the sin. You just had to make the sacrifice. Okay? So I know it sounds kind of like, well, but it's the same way. Does it seem fair now that a murderer can just go and say, Jesus, forgive me of my sins, and he be forgiven? Okay? There is a price to pay for it, yes. But the price they pay, yeah. Yeah. And this is basically the same thing. Even though they, yeah, even though they may be, they're still going to have to face the man-made, penalties for it. Because remember, we're looking at the three. Remember the three different parts of the law. Okay, when we're looking at the law, when people say that we are no longer under the law, you have to ask them, which law are you talking about? Because there's three different laws that we're dealing with here. There's a ceremonial law, which we are no longer under. We are no longer under the ceremonial law. Okay? Jesus fulfilled the ceremonial laws, the atonement laws, the sacrificial laws. Jesus fulfilled those. Then there's the moral law. Well, we're still under the moral law, obviously. We still have to follow the 10 Commandments. Okay? Then there's the civil law. Well, the civil law changes as time goes on, but that's not necessarily something that God is holding everybody to. The civil laws are more of the, now God does put punishments back then for different civil laws that were broken, but it moves on. Now there's I don't remember what I think the TV, I saw a clip of it. I think the show was called West Wing, where one guy is supposed to be the president of the United States and all this stuff. And this lady comes in and she was talking about homosexuality, and the president said, "Well, okay, let me ask you a question. If it's wrong," then he started naming off things. Well, what about I want to sell my daughter into slavery, or somebody's working on the Sabbath, or wearing two different fabrics at the same time. Now that's okay. Yes, those are the law, but that's the civil part of the law. That is not the ceremonial part of the law. Civil law changes. It changes with us. Okay. The penalties change with us. Okay. Used to be, if you drove 20 miles an hour over the speed limit, the speeding ticket would be like $50, $60. Okay, Now you drive 20 miles over speed limit, it's probably a couple of $100. I don't know. I haven't gotten a ticket in a while, but you know, yeah. But that's all civil law. Penalties change, and penalties changed in into the the Jewish civil law. It also changed. Okay, moral law stays the same. Moral law, what was a sin then is still a sin today. No, it wasn't a sin, but it was very good, and it's hard to. Yeah, it's hard to reconcile. Yeah, yeah, you know, it's you know, it's what's that old saying goes? You go to hell for lying the same as you will for stealing. You know, it's there's no degrees of the difference. Okay, sin is sin. Period. Okay. All right. Now, again, not every person gave any or all of these sacrifices every day, or any of these sacrifices every single day. All right. But there were certain sacrifices that were required at certain times. Is the daily sacrifice. There is a weekly sacrifice. There were monthly sacrifices. And then there were yearly sacrifices. And then there was the sacrifice, which most of these fall under, was the as needed. Okay? That they only had to do those sacrifices as they needed to do those sacrifices. Right? So, you know, if you made it through the day without sinning, you don't have to worry about making a sacrifice. It's as needed. Right? Now, the daily sacrifice. The daily sacrifice, the community, that means everybody, was required to offer 2 lambs each day. Now, that doesn't mean each individual person was required to offer 2 lambs every day. It means that the community as a whole offered 2 lambs every day. All right? One was sacrificed in the morning, one was sacrificed in the evening. Okay? This daily sacrifice, this was a continuous and mandatory part of the sacrificial system. Okay? This was basically, and it was a burnt sacrifice. This was basically used to atone for the sins of the community as a whole. Okay? So it was basically, they would bring the sacrifices in the morning to atone for the sins that they committed last night, and then, you know, send one in the evening for the ones they'd committed during the day, whatever. But it was a continuous sacrifice. There was one done in the morning, there was one done at night, right? Then, on top of the daily sacrifice, there was a weekly sacrifice that had to be done. And this weekly sacrifice had to be done on the Sabbath. And again, it was done in addition to the daily sacrifice. So you had the daily sacrifice, one in the morning, one in the evening, still. But on the Sabbath, and we're going to get into what those are, but on the Sabbath, you had another sacrifice that you had to do. All right? It was it was usually a pair of unblemished 1-year-old lambs. All right? So this was the Sabbath offering. With the weekly offering, there was also a grain offering that was done with it. And it consisted of fine flour mixed with olive oil. And there was also a drink offering that was given of wine. All right? But these were consumed by the priests. Okay? The lamb and the other components were burned on the altar as a symbol of complete devotion to God. All right? Now, the monthly offering was made on Rosh Chodesh. which is the new moon. Remember, Israel is on a lunar calendar. We live on a solar calendar. 365 days a year. All right? And if you remember when we were discussing this Daniel 60 weeks, how all of this works out on it to where it was exactly it. Because they were on a lunar calendar. It was 30 days from one new full moon to the next one, the new moon. Okay? That was 30 days. So each month on the new moon, they had to make a sacrifice. So here's the monthly sacrifice. Okay? This was also in addition to the daily sacrifice that had to be done. And if it happened to fall on, I think that's what you were going to ask, if it happened to fall on the Sabbath, then the Sabbath sacrifice was in there as well. Huh? Well, the sacrifices didn't take you think that the sacrifices are taking a lot of time. They're not really. Okay? Well, the person that brought the sacrifice, now the daily sacrifice the priest killed, because that was brought up there. The priest killed it, and they did that. So it's not like not like the whole community's having to go up there and doing it. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. This was a sacrifice that was done by the Kohanim, the priests, every day. Okay? And so that was not something that was real big. Now on the Sabbath sacrifice, they weren't working anyway. Weren't supposed to be working anyway. Okay? The new moon sacrifice, this one, happened once a month. Not a big deal. There's not a lot to it. There wasn't a whole lot of now they didn't have 50 priests that were running around either. Okay? Who were the priests? Aaron and his sons. Yeah. Aaron was the high priest and his son. How many sons did Aaron have? Huh? 2? Had 4 to begin with. 2 of them died because they made bad sacrifices. So 2 of them, God killed 2 of them. So there were 2 of them. Right about this time in Leviticus, there's probably still the 4 of them, because we see how the 2 sons messed up. We'll see that in Numbers, I believe. I think it's in Numbers 20-something. I don't remember for sure. But anyway, the sacrifice on the new moon, it consisted of 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 lambs. Okay? And these were accompanied by specific grain and drink offerings for each animal. Each animal was sacrificed, and they were on there, and they were put on there as the offering, and then there were the grain offering and the drink offerings that were offered with those. All right? Additionally, a young male goat was sacrificed as a sin offering. And that was a sin offering for everybody. In other words, that was to start the month off with a clean slate. So they made the sin offering so they could start the month off. Everybody's got a clean slate. Isn't that be great? Every time every new moon, you get a clean slate. Okay? Now, usually by the next day, that slate's dirty again, but still. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Now, before we get into the yearly sacrifices, because these are going to get a little bit more in-depth about stuff. But let's look at the as-needed sacrifices. Okay? Now, the as-needed sacrifices were made by the individual people. Right? This wasn't one for everybody. It was individual people. They were made for things such as the atonement for sin, of course, Uh, we talked about before, fulfilling a vow, or there's other specific circumstances that they made sacrifices for. Usually ceremonial type of things. If you were unclean, sometimes you had to make a sacrifice in order to get clean, and it was so there's a lot of different things that it was that they had to do sacrifices for, but primarily the as needed sacrifices were for the atonement of sin or fulfilling a vow, things like that. Now, again, these sacrifices were made in addition to the daily sacrifice. So they had the daily sacrifice. First sacrifice made every day was the daily sacrifice. All right? That no other sacrifice could be done until the daily sacrifice was made. Okay? Again, what happened if Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and the Sabbath fell on the same day? That's 3 sacrifices being done. And then anybody that wants to bring the other sacrifices in, that's all being done. Okay? So, how are all these sacrifices handled on the altar? Right? You remember what the size of the altar is? Anybody remember? Huh? Wasn't that? It wasn't real big. It was 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet. 5 cubits by 5 cubits. 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet. Okay? That's not real big, okay? But it was burning constantly, and the sacrifices could be done what they call cumulatively on the altar. Okay? Now here's how that worked. The daily offering was first. The daily sacrifice was done first. It was sacrificed, killed, prepared, placed on the altar. All right? Now, this is not going to, the daily sacrifice is not going to take up the entire altar. It's going to take up part of it, but it's not going to take up the entire altar. So, as the other sacrifices came in order, like the Sabbath, the new moon, the Rosh Chodesh, as these sacrifices were done, then they were placed on top of the other sacrifices. So, in other words, the Sabbath sacrifice was placed on top of the daily sacrifice. Okay? And then the Rosh Chodesh was placed on top of it. The other individual sacrifices were placed on top of those. The as-needed sacrifice was placed on top of those. Okay? And this was done so that the daily sacrifice was burning first, and the other sacrifices were being burnt on that. Finally, the second daily sacrifice, daily lamb that was sacrificed, was put on the very top. Now, after the second daily sacrifice was made, no other sacrifices were made. But remember, the fire had to be burning continually in the altar. Never be put out. The priests had to go in and they had to tend the altar all night long. Make sure there was wood on it. Make sure the fire was burning all the time. So it had all night long for these sacrifices that were stacked up to be burnt. All right? And it doesn't say how many priests. It was Aaron and his sons and his descendants. So the priesthood continued on from Aaron's sons, from Aaron's, the 2 sons that lived. All right? The other 2 sons, like I said, we'll get to that in Numbers. But Aaron and his sons were where the priests came from. Okay? Now this allowed all the sacrifices stacked on top of each other. This allowed them to be burned all night long. So all night long they were there. Now, it's kind of like cremation. Okay? How long does a cremation take? Well, on today's time, a couple hours, you know. It don't take long to cremate a body. Now, you say, yeah, but those things that's 2,000 degrees inside of those crematories, you know, on that. Well, you look at The altar has a fire burning continuously all the time. There's fat, there's all this other stuff that's falling down and fueling this fire as it's burning. It never goes out. It's constantly burning. So it's going to get hot. It's going to get real hot, real fast. Right? So by the morning, all of those other sacrifices should have been consumed before the first sacrifice is made. Of course, it's cleaned. The altar is clean. The ashes are taken outside of the camp. All right? And they're disposed of outside of the camp. But they go back and they start the sacrifices all again. No, no, fire never goes out. They just rake the ashes off. What they've got ashes there, they rake that off. Yeah, yeah, they don't. Yeah, because they didn't have those asbestos suits back then. Okay? But they burned all night. These sacrifices burned all night, and the next morning, then the sacrifice was available, or the altar was available to take sacrifice again. Now, let's look at some of the yearly sacrifices. The first one, and the most important one, it is still the holiest day in Judaism. Anybody know what it is? Huh? No? Nope. We just had it not too long ago. Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. All right? It's the holiest day in all of the Jewish calendar. And it occurs on the 10th day of Tishri, the Jewish month of Tishri. Now, the Jewish months are a little bit different than ours are, obviously, because, again, we're on a solar calendar. They were on a lunar calendar. So Tishri, which was the beginning of the year, okay? Tishri was the beginning of the year when Yom Kippur, okay? And it fell right on along with Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. It corresponds with a date in late September or early October. All right? Let me back up just a second here because I need to get this. The Hebrew months were Tishri, which is September, the last part of September, first part of October. All right? Then there's Keshva, which is the last part of October, first part of November. Kislev is the last part of November, first part of December. Tevet, last of December, first of January. Shavat, January, February. Adar, February, March. Nisan was March, April. Iyar was April, May. Sivan, May and June. Tammuz was June, July. Av was July and August, and then there was Elul, which was August to September. Okay? So that's the Jewish months, just in case you were curious. Okay? So the it is the Yom Kippur is 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, which I said is the Jewish New Year. So the Day of Atonement is 10 days after the New Year starts. All right? So the Day of Atonement is at the very first of the year. That would be like our year starts January 1st, so January 11th, we have a big celebration that is the Day of Atonement that we all have to go to, okay? And sacrifices are made, all right? Now, on Yom Kippur, the high priest would offer a young bull. This was as a sin offering for himself. He had to make, the high priest, he had to make a sin offering for himself and for his family. That was the bull, okay? Then he would offer a ram as a burnt offering for the community. That's for everybody else. All right? The central sacrifice, now this is really interesting when you think about it. The central sacrifice for all of this was the lottery of the 2 male goats. All right? The 2 identical goats were brought together, and they were brought up for the ceremony. Then they cast lots. The high priest would cast lots on the 2 goats. Now remember, we talked about casting lots before. Does anybody remember what that was? Okay, yeah. Yeah, casting lots was something like the process of throwing dice, you know. They would cast dice out there, all right? The lot that fell on the lamb or the goat for the Lord determined the goat that would be sacrificed as a sin offering, okay? The lot that fell on the Azazel or the scapegoat determined the goat that would be sent into the wilderness. Okay? Now, y'all remember how the scapegoat worked. I preached about it one Sunday. Okay? And I think we talked about it in here, too, didn't we? I think we talked about it in this. Talked about the scapegoat. Yeah. Okay. What's a scapegoat? We have scapegoats today, right? What's a scapegoat? Yeah, somebody you put the blame on. Okay? You know, whether you did it or not, you know, usually it's somebody that is at work is somebody who's a little bit lower ranked, somebody that doesn't put up much of a fight about anything, that just kind of accepts everything. You lay the blame on them. They're the scapegoat. This is what the scapegoat is. Okay? And what they did with the scapegoat is they would, after the sin offering was sacrificed, then the high priest would lay both of his hands on the live goat, the scapegoat. And then he would confess all the sins and all the iniquities and all the transgressions of all of Israel over this goat, over the scapegoat. This is where we get scapegoat. This goat got the blame for everybody's sin. All the sin was placed on him. So that's what they got. They put, the high priest would lay his hands on it and put all of the sins of all of Israel on the scapegoat. For the entire year, that goat's got a lot of sin on it. All right? Then the scapegoat, who is now burdened with all the sins of the nation, would be led away and taken out into a remote place. When he got to the remote place, outside of the camp, to this remote place, it was released, let go. Okay? Basically carrying the sins of the people away from the community. That's what it was all about. And the scapegoat was left to fend for itself out there outside the community. Okay? Now on this day, the high priest was the only person, and it, as it always is, but this is the only day that the high priest would go in to the Holy of Holies. It was the only day that he was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. I know we get a lot of times we get the idea that the high priest was constantly going into the Holy of Holies. He wasn't. He was only allowed to go into the Holy of Holies one day out of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. That was it. Okay? Because he had to make certain sacrifices within the Holy of Holies. And he had to sprinkle some of the blood on the Ark of the Covenant. Now the Ark of the Covenant, if you remember, had two angels, two cherubs at the top, which was considered the mercy seat of God. That's where God dwelt. Now remember also on this, there's a cloud above the tabernacle. There's a cloud above the Holy of Holies, which signified what? The presence of God. It's a cloud by night, or cloud by day, and a pillar of fire by night was always there. Okay? If you didn't see that pillar of fire at night or that cloud by day, God wasn't there. And that's the last thing they wanted, was for God not to be there. Okay? Now, there are 3 other festivals that are held throughout the year. Most of they were celebrated, some in that time, but in later years, after the establishment of the temple, these 3 festivals became yearly pilgrimages that each male Israelite was required to make. So every male was required to make these pilgrimages to the temple after the establishment of the temple. Okay? Before it was, well, we'll get into that. The first one was the Passover. Now, the Passover, believe it or not, was only celebrated the first year. Only the first year after they escaped from Egypt. For 39 years after that they wandered in the wilderness, Passover was not observed. Okay? Why was that? It's a good question. I'm so glad you asked me that. Such an intelligent group of people. Let me answer that for you. Because Passover required a central, permanent place for the tabernacle. And they were constantly moving. There was no permanent place for the tabernacle. So, Passover could not be celebrated. Okay? All right. I duplicated a slide. All right. The next yearly sacrifice is called Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, also known as the Feast of Tabernacle. The observance of Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks in the wilderness, was tied to the pivotal moment that the Israelites received the Torah on Mount Sinai. Okay? That happened, if you'll remember, 50 days after they left Egypt. Okay? This established, when they received it, this established the covenant between God and the Jewish people. All right? This was when God said, "You're mine. We're marking you as a covenant. This people is my people. This is my covenant between me and you." Now remember, there were covenants made before this. There was a covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There was all the other covenants were made, but this is the covenant that God made with the children of Israel that says, "I am your God, okay? You are my people." And it marked their transition from a group of refugees that were fleeing a nation to a nation with a defined purpose. Okay? A covenant is always going to have a divine purpose to it. A covenant is a divine relationship contract, if you will, between God and his people. We live under the new covenant, but we have another covenant. It is a covenant that we live under. Right? Just like they had the old covenant, we've got the new. Now, the agrarian or agricultural aspects of Shavuot, the wheat harvest and bringing in the first fruits, these were not observed in the wilderness. All right? Because this was tied to the land of Israel. Primarily because while they were in the wilderness, they really didn't do I mean, they did some farming, but they weren't in one place long enough to do a whole lot of farming. Now, they couldn't be there to plant wheat and all this other stuff. Plus, they're in a place that's kind of hard to you know, to grow. I see all these. Um, things where they send all this people that living out in the desert and living out in these countries like that, and they're sending them food out to them all the time. And I think we ought to stop that in this country. What I think we need to do is send them U-Hauls. Okay? Send them U-Hauls and go out there and say, hey, look, we were thinking about something on our way out here this time, that you wouldn't need us to bring food if you would just move to where the food is. Hey? Yeah. You're living in the desert. Nothing's going to grow here. See, this is sand. In 100 years, it's still going to be sand. You know? Yeah. You know, we have deserts in this country too, but we don't live in them for the most part. You know. Anyway. Yeah. But anyway, that's just you know, that was kind of having fun. Yes. It's wet sand. Yes. Now, but these holidays were centered solely on the Sinai revelation at that time. The sacrifices made during Shavuot were 2 loaves of leavened bread. Leavened bread. What's the difference between these and the other ones? Eh? The other ones didn't have leaven in it. Why? See how much y'all paying attention. Why? Yeah, leaven represented sin. Okay? These were usually presented as a wave offering. Okay? That's what they were presented at. And were the only leavened breads offered as a sacrifice. The burnt offering during this time included 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 one-year-old lambs. There was also a sin offering of 1 male goat was offered to make atonement, and 2 one-year-old lambs were sacrificed as a peace offering. Okay? Now, the next one is the festival called Hag HaSif, or the Feast of Ingathering. This holiday was celebrated in the fall for the harvest. It was later called Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. This celebrated God's deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. And this holiday was celebrated in the fall. Okay? As I said, all right, we'll see these festivals later in later chapters. They'll be described in later chapters in Leviticus, and also when we get into Numbers, we will see some of these more. The sacrifices that were to be made on Sukkot involved a large number of bulls, rams, and lambs offered over 7 days. Now, keep track of this, all right? On day 1, it was 13 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and 1 goat. That's day 1. Just day 1. Day 2 was 12 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and 1 goat. On day 3, 11 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, 1 goat. Day 4, 10 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, 1 goat. See the pattern here? Okay? It's going down each day as they go on. Day 5, just the bulls. Day 5 was 9 bulls. Day 6, 8 bulls. Day 7, anybody care to guess? 7 bulls. Yes, very good. 7 bulls, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and 1 goat, for a total of 70 bulls for the week. Okay? And on day 8, a separate smaller sacrifice was also offered, consisting of 1 bull, 1 ram, and 7 lambs. Okay? Yeah, now you think, wow, that's a whole lot. Okay? But if you'll remember, when Solomon was going to the temple after he had dedicating the temple, when Solomon was going there, he sacrificed 120,000 bulls. So that was a lot of, there's a lot of sacrificing going on, and a bunch of other ones. But there's a lot of other stuff that's going on. In addition to the burnt offerings, a sin offering of one goat was sacrificed each day as well. Now, how did Jesus fulfill the biblical sacrifices? By being the ultimate perfect offering that made the Old Testament system of sacrifice obsolete. So let's look at each sacrifice and see how Jesus fulfilled it. I'm going to try to hurry so we can get done in time. The unblemished animal, completely consumed by fire, is fulfilled by Christ's perfect life and his willing, complete sacrifice for humanity. That's the burnt offering. Okay? The offering of flour and oil and frankincense without yeast, which is sin, represents Jesus as the sinless bread of life. Okay? Who provides spiritual nourishment to us. A sacrifice for sin, the sin sacrifice, where the blood was offered and the rest was burnt outside the camp, is fulfilled by Christ dying outside of the walls, the city walls, to pay the penalty for all sin, past, present, and future. This was for specific sin, including those that required restitution. Christ's sacrifice provides forgiveness for all sin, including sins that cause damage or that cause a breach of faith. Okay? The peace offering. Peace offering was a communal meal. It was shared by the giver, the priest, and God, and it signified fellowship. Jesus is our peace offering, reconciling us with God and enabling us to have fellowship with him. Okay? Christ's sacrifice was the one sacrifice for sins forever. Okay? That replaced the need for any further animal sacrifices, okay, because of Christ's perfect sacrifice. Because of that, we're no longer required to follow the Old Testament sacrificial laws. And as I've said before, the people who clean the church are thankful for that we don't have to do that. His sacrifice also provides a new way for us to worship. As Christians are all called to present their bodies as living sacrifices to God. Okay? So now we see what the sacrifices were, how they were fulfilled by Christ. Okay? And did that answer some of the questions that some of you had about the sacrifices? Did that confuse some of you? Okay. Well, hopefully this has shown you a little bit more of what the sacrifices were, how they were, when they were conducted, how they were conducted. And next week we'll get back into Leviticus. I think we're in Leviticus 7 now, is where we're going to next. So next week we'll get into Leviticus 7 and start talking about Levitical. This stuff is really fascinating when you get into it instead of just reading it. When you get into it and understand all the stuff behind it, it's a lot more fascinating than just going, okay, like reading a book. Okay? It gets when you start getting into this and looking at it in that depth, it brings a whole new understanding to the Bible. It brings a whole new way of looking at what you're reading. Now, some of you in your Bible reading can go back and go, "Oh yeah, we covered that. We talked about that." And eventually, if we get it done before the rapture happens, we will, the way we're going, we may get it done on the church's 60th anniversary. Because this is I think 85 weeks so far, and we're just now in Leviticus. So yeah. The widow sacrifices. Oh yeah, yeah. It was the families. If a widow had a family, it was the family's responsibility to take care of the widow, not the church. Yeah, yeah. Usually, actually, in those times, now we'll get into this as we get into the Levitical law a little bit more. But if a woman, if her husband died and she didn't have a child by her husband, then the brother was supposed to marry her to give her a child in his name. Yeah. So the brother was supposed to take her for a wife. Okay? So, so if a guy, if this guy, two people are married and he dies, then his brother is supposed to take her to be his wife, to give her a child, if she died without a child. Okay. Well, her sons will if she had children. If she didn't have children, then the brother takes care of them. All right. Anything else? Okay. Was this helpful tonight? It answered some questions that some of y'all had. Okay, good. All right. Then if there is nothing else, then Pastor, take us out.
Thank you for joining us today. We pray you were blessed by the broadcast. If you have a prayer request or questions about Solid Rock Tabernacle, please visit our website at www.solidrocktabernacle.org. That's www